All right, guys, some huge breaking news in the world of MMA, and we had to get this man on to get his reaction. This is, of course, brought to you by Manscaped, NordVPN, and MyBookie. Make sure to check out the links in the description below. And use the code word submission, 20% off and free shipping today. Dan Hardy, welcome to Submission Radio. I feel like this is a major, major moment in the history of MMA, so let's get right into it. Francis Ngannou let go from the UFC, able to go to other companies, negotiate with other people. Jon Jones coming back and fighting Ciryl Gane. Let's just get into the first question. How massive of a deal is it that Francis Ngannou is the first UFC active champion to leave the UFC since BJ Penn in 2004, Dan?
It's crazy. It's a very interesting move by him. Obviously, I'd like to know more details about what deal was offered to him and what the sticking point was for Ngannou. I mean, he seems like quite a righteous individual, and I think if he's decided he needs something, out of whether it's respect, I can't imagine the deciding factor is the financial part. I'm sure there's something else, and I would imagine that Francis is going to be determined to stick to his guns, and hopefully in the next few months we find out where the deal broke down, but. It's very, very interesting. It creates a very, a huge fish in the MMA pond that could potentially go elsewhere. We've got Ante Delea over at PFL. I think that would be an interesting one. Of course, one championship. We've got a very active heavyweight division. Who knows? I mean, the world is his oyster, if you like.
I'm going to speculate here a little bit, but I think it was the boxing part because Francis for the last 1,000 years has said that he wants to box regardless. He wants to have that Tyson Fury fight. And it seems like the UFC offered him a lot of money. I mean, Dana White's saying that he would have been the highest paid UFC heavyweight ever, more than Brock Lesnar, more than anybody. So you got to think the money would have been, in theory, pretty good. But I think it was just that freedom to do boxing. And then, like you said, there was probably a bit of respect as well. Maybe other kinds of guarantees. I think the UFC probably didn't want to open the floodgates to all the fighters getting these crossover fights like Conor did with Mayweather back in the day. So I think they were probably thinking long term. Here's a question though, Dan. You mentioned some promotions. Let's say the UFC was paying Francis, say, multi-million dollars per fight, in the deal. Which promotion do you think sort of could pay him that much or more and then still make a profit? Because you got to think like, I'm guessing he goes to PFL. To me, that seems like an attractive sort of scenario for him. But let's say PFL or Bellator paid Francis millions per fight. Would it actually be worth it for them? Or do you think in Francis' eyes, he's thinking, man, if I can just get the Tyson Fury, I'm getting tens of millions here?
It might be just those one or two big fights that are potentially, within his reach now. He was the UFC heavyweight champion. He's kind of earned the right to call on some super fights. And I think there's a lot of money associated with them. But it also sounds like he's still interested in MMA. And I think, to be honest, any of the other organizations, of course, it's going to have to be an investment to bring Ngannou into the roster. But there are two or three organizations that are in that situation right now where they kind of need a couple of big fish. Of course, with Jake Paul joining PFL, that makes it very interesting. And, I wouldn't be surprised if we see Tyson Fury flirting the idea of MMA as well. I mean, we've seen him training with Till at Cowbon, and I've spoke to the guy myself. He's a scrapper. His father, John Fury's got teeth marks all up and down his elbows and forearms. We could see something quite interesting going on with Jake Paul's involvement, bringing a couple of boxers together, perhaps to fight him under MMA rules. I think it's a very interesting time for mixed martial arts. And I think that the fact that he stood his ground, if he can find his worth elsewhere, it's going to make it more attractive to other fighters to do the same thing. The thing is with the freedom when it comes to wanting to box, if there was enough money to be made by Dana and the UFC, they would have allowed him to do it. Now, of course, they're going to protect him to a certain point because Dana's going to be smart and know that against the majority of heavyweight boxers that have got, decent footwork and a jab, he might struggle with the big gloves on. But, Dana also thinks short term. And I think if there was money to be made, he would have made those agreements. So I still feel like there's a sticking point in there somewhere it's not just down to the freedom to box, because I still think he could have had that freedom if there was a financial agreement to back it up, if that makes sense.
I see a man here who's willing to bet on himself and give up potentially a lucrative deal to see what he can do outside of the UFC. And I mean, Tyson Fury is one of the greatest heavyweight boxers of all time, and it's hard to imagine anybody beating him with the challenges that he brings in there. So before we sort of talk about that fight, do you believe that if he loses really badly to a Tyson Fury or a Deontay Wilder, he still has the same, I suppose, draw and interest from the people to go over to Bellator and PFL and make that kind of money that he wants to make right now?
I think so, absolutely. Yeah, I think so. I mean, he's stepping outside of his own sport if he's competing in boxing, and he's doing something similar to what McGregor did with Mayweather. And, of course, McGregor was able to, he was able to stand in a boxing ring with a boxer and not look out of place. The danger with Ngannou is that because he is so powerful and reckless, he might look very out of place. And so I think his boxing career might be very short-lived if it doesn't work out. But I think if he's matched correctly, I think I think that there's the potential for him to have a couple of matches that, are within his capability to land on his opponents. Some people, like Tyson Fury, is going to be an absolute nightmare because of his ability to defend massive shots and even take big shots. I don't think it changes his market value in mixed martial arts. I think it raises the interest if he's keen on stepping outside of his comfort zone to try these things. But ultimately, he's still a massive name in mixed martial arts, and heavyweight as well is always a bigger investment that organizations are willing to go for. He could bring a lot of interest to any organization that he signs with, and the question is, what heavyweights do they have on the table to make it interesting for the fans to tune in? Like, honestly, Ante Delea, I think would be a really problematic fight for him in a lot of different ways. Trained by Crow Cop, good footwork, can grapple, can wrestle. Of course, we've seen Ngannou's grappling's improved, but there's still a lot of questions there, and I think the UFC have played a very clever game by keeping Jon Jones out of the picture. Because, say if Jon Jones could have fought in October, why would they not have matched him? They wouldn't have matched him because he's the big fish to try and get Ngannou to re-sign. Now, because Jon Jones and Ngannou have never faced one another, we don't know who the better fighter is. There are big questions around Jon Jones coming up to heavyweight. I mean, he's starting as an underdog against Ciryl Gane, which is quite interesting. So you've got to think that they've got an ace up their sleeve here, because they can always say that Jon Jones was always the better heavyweight out of the two of them because it's never been proved wrong. And I think that that's something they'll try and kind of change the narrative with to try and devalue Ngannou. It might even coax him back if Jon Jones does win the heavyweight title. But it's very, very interesting, isn't it? Wouldn't you love to be a fly on the wall in those discussions?
Yeah, well, you just mentioned it, and I got to find out from you your thoughts. Do you think that, and we've seen it happen before, fighters leave UFC and come back, if Francis is able to go off, have some success, or even if he's not, do you still see a possibility that the UFC takes him back and we still get some of those fights in the future?
I think so. I think the fact that they've not made his departure too difficult for him, it shows like that there's an olive branch there ready for him to come back if he does choose to. But at the same time, the deal when he comes back, especially if he goes over to boxing and faces somebody, a Tyson Fury or Deontay Wilder, Anthony Joshua would be an interesting one as well. If he fought one of those guys and just looked terrible and then came back to the UFC, they would cut that offer in, they would cut a decent amount off the offer. So that's kind of the gamble that they're playing, allowing him to step away and try and find his market value elsewhere. But I think the door will be open for him, especially if Jon Jones is the champ, because what may happen is Jon Jones might hold the heavyweight division down like he did the light heavyweight division. And then they might be struggling for interest in, heavyweight headliners, which would be really a real problem for the UFC, because heavyweight is, that's what people really tune in for most of the time, let's be honest.
Yeah, that's a good point. If the heavyweight division became kind of like the light heavyweight division, where it's like, okay, it's the Jon Jones show, and then it can tend to get a little bit stale in that sense. I feel like for Francis, the smart play is to go straight into like a boxing while his value is as hot as possible, make this potential, Tyson Fury, or I think it'll be Tyson Fury, but let's go maybe Deontay Wilder fight, and then cash in on that, and then I'll be betting on either a Deontay or a Tyson Fury, and then if those guys win, then he can still go to like a PFL or a Bellator and then make his money with sponsorships, and then he'll still be like a hot commodity, as opposed to gambling in MMA. You don't know how it's going to go. What if he loses a couple of fights and then all of a sudden that Tyson Fury fight isn't as, an attractive of a fight? And I think it's also a clever play from the UFC getting this vacant heavyweight belt, fought for immediately, like March is right around the corner. And so you think by the time Francis fights, there will already be a new UFC heavyweight champion. So it's not like they can say, Tyson Fury versus the heavyweight champion. It'll be, well, he's the former heavyweight champion from a marketing strategic perspective. But I got to ask, Dan, what were your thoughts on Jon Jones, your immediate sort of reaction to Jon Jones and Ciryl Gane being matched up? As in, we've been waiting for Jon Jones to make his heavyweight debut for the longest time now. What do you think about Ciryl Gane being the opponent that he finally gets matched up with?
I think of all the fighters that he could have drawn at heavyweight, this is probably the most difficult for a variety of different reasons.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at the skills, the movement that Ciryl Gane has, and they were Jon Jones' advantages at light heavyweight. So now Jones is going up a weight class against someone who's physiologically, naturally very big compared to Jon Jones, like thick, heavy legs, big, strong upper body as well. Like that's not going to be anything like Jon Jones has faced at light heavyweight. He's going to move like the majority of light heavyweights do, which is going to be really problematic for him. Jones has always struggled with people that have got similar physical attributes and benefits to him. Like you look at the first Gustafsson fight, it was footwork, it was movement, it was speed, it was reach. These were all the advantages that Jon Jones had over his opponents, as well as obviously, a good handle of the MMA skill set and a very creative mind. You can say the same things about Ciryl Gane. He's had so much success in a short period of time. He's a very measured fighter. He's got fantastic footwork. He's very good at moving in and out of range and stinging. He's a very smart individual. These are all advantages that Jon Jones has had in previous fights that he gives up at this one. It doesn't surprise me at all that it doesn't surprise me that he's starting as the underdog on the betting odds. I do think that will shift, but it shows you what people are expecting from Ciryl Gane and the advantages that he has of being active. It's been a long time since Jon Jones has fought, and he's never fought in this body that he's walking around in now, which is 50 pounds heavier than the last time we saw him compete. It's a very, very different prospect, and he's stepping in over 5 rounds straight away for the heavyweight belt. Like, what's he going to feel like if Cyril's able to clinch him and wrestle him a little bit and then break and strike and move? And he might find himself very tired in ways like he's never felt before at light heavyweight.
The tiredness for me is a huge one. Like, just carrying all that extra weight. But do you think it's also interesting in terms of like Jon Jones has been gaining all this muscle, all this mass, and I think in the back of his mind, yeah, sure, maybe it could have been Stipe or someone else, but I think in the back of his mind, it was like, it's going to be Francis down the line, so I need to be as strong as possible for that. But now he's fighting somebody like Ciryl, who doesn't rely on that power. He's not like, a massive, ginormous heavy. He's like you said, he's a big, muscly guy, but speed is his advantage. So it's kind of interesting that Jon Jones has been putting on this size. Do you think in any way it almost, I don't know, maybe costs him in the fight?
Well, I mean, I think his intention against Francis would have been to grapple, wouldn't it? It would have been the smart thing to do to, take him down and use his superior wrestling and grappling skills to, really force Francis to work. I think he can do the same thing to Ciryl. I just don't think it'd be quite as easy to close that distance because Cyril's, far more measured with his striking than Francis is. Not quite as dangerous, but that, like if you Jon Jones, it's much easier to define what the danger is against Francis Ngannou. Against Ciryl Gane, it can be a number of things. It can be footwork and speed and, fatigue setting in, as well as him being, physically a very strong individual, much bigger than a light heavyweight that he would have faced. It's a challenging fight for Jon Jones. And if he finds himself in there quite flat-footed and Cyril's moving around and chopping into his legs, and it could run away from him very quickly. You don't know where his confidence is at after such a long time out, and you don't know how he's going to feel as a heavyweight being in there against someone that doesn't move like a heavyweight. Lots of questions on the table for Jon Jones right now, I think.
Francis or Ciryl, who do you think is the tougher fight for Jon Jones?
Oh, I don't. It's difficult to put a a decision either way, because I think they're both challenging in different ways. You know, the thing is with Ciryl is that he can control a fight, he can control the pace, he can, you know, he's very, very good at revving the engine and kind of changing the range on Jon Jones, and he can do that for 25 minutes. So it makes the windows of opportunity to strike him with anything meaningful quite slim. But then with Ngannou, it's all about that unorthodox, brutal power that he's got. I mean, I always think to myself, you know, you look at his fight against Rosenstrike, who's, you know, a very, very experienced kickboxer who has dealt with kickboxers, heavyweight punchers for, you know, throughout his entire kickboxing career. But you watch the slow motion attack of Ngannou, where he's running at him like a tornado. How do you predict for that? It's that's the scary thing about it, is you're getting hit with punches that come from really odd angles, and you know, he can hit you with the inside of his glove and it's still going to knock you out. It might even hit you with his wrist and knock you out. That is so difficult to prepare for. But it also it keeps the it keeps the goal really, really clear for Jon Jones. Stay away from that power. Ciryl Gane presents a few different ones. I would say he's a more tricky opponent. But I would say, of course, Ngannou's more lethal. Yeah, it could be going all Jon Jones's way, and then all of a sudden it's different.
It's almost like the more challenging versus the more dangerous. All right, last one on this. I'm curious sort of which is the more exciting trajectory in your mind in terms of who wins. Because in Gane's case, like, he's looking phenomenal. He looks like he could potentially be the future of the division. And you got to think he'll probably stick around, I think, for longer than Jon Jones. Like, you don't really know how many more fights Jon Jones has in him. It could be this one and that's it. It could be, you know, this one and then one or two or however many more. And also Gane sort of holds the keys to that French market in terms of marketability. Then in Jon Jones, you've got obviously Jon being the far bigger name. And then there's just the excitement of seeing a guy, you know, achieve such greatness. That's really the exciting part. So in the UFC's eyes, they could have an even bigger star in Jon Jones if he's able to do this. But then with Jon Jones, it's like he's nothing if not unreliable. So you got to wonder what's going to happen with him holding the belt. I'm curious on that. And then also as we let you go on this one, Dan, just who are you leaning towards early days?
I think it makes a lot more sense for the UFC if Jon Jones wins, because then you can speculate that all along Jon Jones was better than Francis, and Francis was only the heavyweight champion because Jon Jones wasn't there, which makes him far stronger and easier to market as the legitimate most dangerous man on the planet at heavyweight. If Ciryl Gane wins, you know,
it's a good point.
I mean, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think that is the underlying point there is that there's a question around whether Jon Jones is better than Francis at the moment, and there's not the question the other way around. So it's much easier to market Jon Jones. And like you said, Cyril's early in his career. Most likely what's going to happen is he'll have 2 or 3 more fights and then find himself facing Jon Jones a second time if Jones wins. But I also don't think it'd be such a bad thing, not necessarily for the UFC, but more for Jon Jones, if he doesn't pick up the win the first time around, because it will make him respect the heavyweight division as a different entity to light heavyweight. He'll also recognize that the sport at heavyweight has moved on since he was the light heavyweight champ. I mean, you've got to think, like Ciryl Gane is a different type of fighter to the Andrei Arlovskis and the Stipes that were, you know, at the top of the heavyweight division when Jones was light heavyweight champ. It would also, I think it would also allow people to like him a little bit more, you know, because I think a lot of people don't like Jon Jones because it seems like he's gotten away with a lot of stuff and he's found things easier than most people would, and that makes a lot of people envious. Whereas I think if there was a little bit of struggle in there, you know, he's trying to take on something that's greater than the light heavyweight campaign that he's already been on. He's extending himself. It doesn't quite work out the first time, but he can come around and get it a second time. I think we'll see Jon Jones as the heavyweight champ for sure. But I think it suits the UFC certainly for him to be this time the heavyweight champ instead of losing and coming back again and winning it later.
Yeah. Well, we'll be chatting about this fight a lot more in a couple of months. Follow them out on Twitter and Instagram at Dan Hardy MMA, of course. Check out Full Reptile's excellent work on BT Sport with the Dan Hardy breakdown show, The War Room, and his book Part Reptile. Dan, thank you so much for chatting with us about this. We'll see you in about 2 seconds for the UFC 280 preview show.
Thanks.